Marcus Caldwell hadn't spoken to a child in 15 years, not since the accident, not since he'd locked away every photograph, every memory, every piece of his heart that could still feel pain. His ranch in the Colorado mountains had become his fortress, 2,000 acres of solitude where the only sounds were wind through pine trees and cattle lowing in distant pastures. But on an October morning that started like any other, 4 strangers would appear at his gate, carrying nothing but a crumpled letter and a desperation that would shatter the walls he'd spent years building. What Marcus didn't know was that these weren't ordinary visitors. They were about to change everything he thought he knew about family, loss, and the courage it takes to love again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel crunched under worn sneakers as 4 figures trudged up the winding dirt road toward the Caldwell Ranch. 16-year-old Emma Rodriguez clutched a folded piece of paper in her left hand, while her right arm wrapped protectively around her youngest brother's shoulders. At 7, Danny was small for his age, his dark hair falling into eyes that had seen too much for someone who should still believe in fairy tales. Behind them walked the twins, Caleb and Sophia, both 13, their faces masks of practiced indifference that fooled no one. The September morning was crisp in the Colorado Rockies, with frost still clinging to the tall grass that bordered the road. Each breath came out in small puffs of vapor, and Emma pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself. They'd been walking since dawn, having caught the earliest bus from Denver that would drop them at the crossroads 5 miles back. The social worker, Mrs. Henderson, had given them the address along with a warning that felt more like a threat. "This is your last option. Make it work." Emma's stomach growled, reminding her that the stale donuts they'd grabbed at the bus station were their only meal in 16 hours. She glanced back at the twins. Caleb was limping slightly. His left shoe had a hole that let in rocks and cold, while Sophia maintained that determined silence she'd perfected over the past 3 months of failed placements. Danny hadn't complained once during the long walk. Though Emma could feel him shivering against her side, the ranch house materialized through the morning mist like something from another century. It was massive, 2 stories of weathered wood and stone with a wraparound porch that spoke of better days. Several barns dotted the property, and in the distance, Emma could make out cattle moving like dark shadows across rolling fields. Split rail. Fencing stretched as far as the eye could see, disappearing into stands of aspen trees whose leaves had turned brilliant gold. But it was the silence that struck her most. No dogs barking, no sounds of life or activity. Even the cattle seemed to move without sound, like ghosts grazing in a forgotten world. As they approached the house, Emma noticed details that made her chest tighten with uncertainty. Paint peeling from the porch railings, windows that looked like they hadn't been opened in years, a front door that seemed more barrier than welcome. This wasn't the warm, inviting home she'd allowed herself to imagine during the bus ride. Danny pressed closer to her side. What if he doesn't want us?" The question hung in the cold air like their visible breath. Emma smoothed down his cowlick, a gesture that had become automatic over the years of being more mother than sister. "He will," she whispered, though her own voice betrayed her doubts. "He has to." They climbed the 3 steps to the porch, and Emma noticed how their footsteps echoed hollowly against the old wood. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the window beside the door, she caught a glimpse of the interior, sparse, furniture covered in dust sheets, walls bare of photographs or personal touches. It looked more like a mausoleum than a home. Before she could lose her nerve, she knocked firmly 3 times. The sound seemed to reverberate through the house like gunshots. They waited. Danny shifted his weight from foot to foot, a nervous habit he'd developed during their time in the system. Sophia examined her fingernails with studied indifference. Caleb stared out at the mountains as if memorizing their peaks. Heavy footsteps approached the door, slow and deliberate. Emma straightened her shoulders, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The deadbolt turned with a metallic click, then another. Finally, the door opened. Marcus Caldwell was not what any of them had expected. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway and hands that looked like they could split wood with their bare strength. His hair was steel grey, longer than fashionable, and his face was weathered by years of mountain sun and wind. But it was his eyes that made Emma take an involuntary step backward. They were the palest blue she'd ever seen, like winter sky, and they held an emptiness that seemed to swallow light. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Danny's thin frame and the way the twins stood slightly behind Emma, as if she were their shield. When his eyes finally settled on Emma, she forced herself to meet them directly. "Mr. Caldwell?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "I'm Emma Rodriguez. These are my brothers and sisters, Danny, Caleb and Sophia." She gestured to each in turn, grateful when Danny managed a small wave, despite his nervousness. "We're here about the letter." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those pale eyes. What letter? Emma's heart sank. Had Mrs. Henderson been wrong? Had the Social Services Department made another mistake? With trembling fingers, she unfolded the piece of paper she'd been clutching. "From the Department of Social Services, about temporary placement. They said you'd agreed to—" "I agreed to nothing." His voice was rough from disuse, each word delivered like a judgment. The 4 siblings stood frozen on the porch as the words sank in. Emma felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Behind her, she heard Sophia's sharp intake of breath and Danny's quiet whimper. "There must be some mistake," Emma said, though she knew there wasn't. There never was, not when it came to their luck. "They said you were approved for emergency placement, that you'd agreed to take us temporarily while they found something more permanent." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I never agreed to any such thing. Haven't had contact with social services in over a decade." He started to close the door. "You'll have to go back where you came from. Please." The word escaped Emma's lips before she could stop it. "Please just listen for a minute." Something in her tone made him pause, though the door remained mostly closed. "We don't have anywhere else to go," Emma continued, her composure beginning to crack. "This was our last option. We've been in 7 different homes in the past year. 7. And I know we're not perfect. I know we're difficult, but we're good. Kids, we won't cause trouble. We just need somewhere to stay until they find us a real family." "I'm not running a boarding house," Marcus said flatly. "We're not asking for charity," Emma replied quickly. "We can work. I'm 16. I can clean, cook, do laundry. The twins are strong. We can help around the ranch. We won't be a burden." Marcus looked at them again, his gaze traveling from Emma's determined face to Danny's trembling lip to the twins' careful masks of indifference. For a moment, something almost human flickered across his features, then it was gone. "The answer is no. Call whoever sent you and tell them to come get you." "They won't come," Sophia spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a bitterness that seemed too old for her 13 years. "They dropped us off and left. Said it was our responsibility to make it work this time." Marcus's hand stilled on the door. "They left you here without confirming I'd take you?" "They had other cases," Emma said quietly. "Other kids to place. They said you were our best option because you lived far enough from town that we couldn't run away easily." For several long seconds, the only sounds were the wind through the pine trees and the distant lowing of cattle. Marcus's knuckles were white where he gripped the door frame. "How long have you been walking?" he asked finally. "Since dawn," Danny piped up, then seemed to shrink back when Marcus's attention focused on him. Marcus's gaze moved to their faces, taking in details he'd missed before. The hollows under Emma's eyes, the way Caleb favored his left foot, the thin jackets that offered little protection against the mountain cold. The careful way they stood together, a unit forged by necessity and hardship. "You can't stay here," he said, but some of the edge had left his voice. "Where else can we go?" Emma asked simply. "It's a 20-mile walk back to town. We don't have money for a bus. And even if we made it, there's nowhere for them to send us. We're aging out of the system anyway. They're just trying to find somewhere for the younger ones." "I'm not equipped for children," Marcus said, though he made no move to close the door. "We're not really children anymore," Caleb spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. "We take care of ourselves." Marcus looked at him, really looked, and Emma saw something shift in his expression. The boy was thin, too thin, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many nights worrying about tomorrow. His sister, Sophia, stood beside him with the rigid posture of someone who'd learned not to expect comfort from adults. "I don't have room," Marcus said, but it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. "We don't need much space," Emma said quickly, "just somewhere warm to sleep. We're used to sharing rooms. We won't get in your way." Danny's teeth began to chatter audibly, and Marcus's jaw tightened. The morning had grown colder, and frost was beginning to form on the porch railings. "This is temporary," he said finally, stepping back from the door. "Until you can arrange something else." Emma's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Caldwell. We won't have any trouble, I promise." Marcus didn't respond. He simply walked away from the door, leaving it open behind him. The four siblings exchanged glances before following him into the house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior was even more stark than Emma had glimpsed through the window. The furniture was functional but impersonal. A couch and chairs that looked like they'd never been sat in. A dining table bare of decoration, walls empty of photographs or personal touches. Everything was clean, but felt lifeless, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. Marcus led them through the main room to a kitchen that was surprisingly large and well-equipped. The appliances looked modern, though they had the unused appearance of everything else in the house. "There's bread and peanut butter," he said, without looking at them. "Make what you need." Emma quickly moved to the cupboards, finding the promised supplies, along with some crackers and canned soup. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared sandwiches for her siblings, the relief of having food and shelter momentarily overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Danny climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs, his feet dangling well above the floor. Marcus glanced at him, and Emma caught something unguarded in his expression. A flash of pain so raw it took her breath away. Then his features shuttered again, and he looked away. "There are bedrooms upstairs," he said abruptly. "Pick whichever ones you want. I'll be in the south barn if you need anything urgent." He was halfway to the door when Emma called after him. "Mr. Caldwell." He paused but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said simply. "We won't forget this kindness." Marcus's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Emma thought he might say something. Instead, he continued walking and let the screen door slam shut behind him. The four siblings sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. They had shelter. They had food. For the first time in months, they weren't facing the unknown. "He doesn't want us here," Sophia said quietly. "No," Emma agreed, watching through the window as Marcus's figure disappeared into the barn. "But he let us stay anyway?" "Why?" Danny asked, taking a big bite of his sandwich. Emma didn't have an answer for that. All she knew was that beneath Marcus Caldwell's cold exterior she'd glimpsed something, a flicker of recognition maybe, or understanding. As if he knew what it felt like to be alone in a world that didn't seem to have space for you. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, dark and heavy with the promise of snow. But for now, they were inside. They were warm. They were together. It was enough. It had to be enough, because Emma had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant accepting whatever small kindnesses the world offered, even when they came wrapped in warnings and reluctance, even when they came from a man who looked at children with the haunted eyes of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. The bedrooms upstairs told stories Marcus Caldwell had tried to forget. Emma pushed open the first door and found herself looking at a child's room frozen in time. A twin bed with a faded blue comforter, shelves lined with books about dinosaurs and space exploration, a wooden toy chest with hand-carved horses along its edges. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through windows that overlooked the pastures beyond. Danny peeked around her shoulder. Whose room was this? Emma felt her throat tighten, the careful way Marcus had avoided looking at them, especially Danny. The pain that had flashed across his face in the kitchen. The house felt more like a shrine than a home. Someone who used to live here, she said softly, guiding Danny away from the doorway. Let's find another room. They settled the boys in a guest room at the end of the hall, sparse but clean, with 2 single beds and a dresser that had seen better days. Emma and Sophia took the room across the hall, equally simple, but with a window that faced the mountains. As the afternoon wore on, the siblings fell into the rhythm they'd perfected over months of moving from place to place, unpacking their few belongings, establishing their small territories, preparing for another temporary stay. But this place felt different. The silence wasn't just absence of noise, it was the kind of quiet that comes from years of unspoken grief. Emma found herself moving carefully, as if one wrong step might shatter something precious and irreplaceable. Around 4 o'clock, Danny discovered the piano. It sat in what must have once been a living room, covered by a white sheet like everything else in the house. Danny's curiosity had always been stronger than his caution, and before Emma could stop him, he'd pulled away the cover to reveal a beautiful upright piano, its dark wood gleaming despite years of neglect. "Emma, look!" he whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. Danny had always been drawn to music. In their previous placements, he'd hummed constantly, creating melodies that seemed to spring from somewhere deep inside him. Now he reached out with one small finger and pressed a single key. The note hung in the air, pure and clear, the first real sound the house had heard in years. The screen door slammed open so hard it bounced off the wall. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face white with fury and something deeper, a pain so raw it made Emma step instinctively in front of Danny. "Get away from that," Marcus said, his voice barely controlled. Danny snatched his hand back as if the key had burned him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Nobody touches that piano." Marcus's words cut through the air like shattered glass. "Nobody." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Marcus's harsh breathing. Emma could feel her siblings behind her, could sense their familiar preparation for whatever came next, the accusations, the packing, the inevitable departure. She'd seen adults lose control before, had learned to read the signs that meant their temporary haven was about to collapse. But Marcus didn't yell. Instead, he carefully replaced the sheet over the piano, his movements gentle despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "There are rules if you're staying here," he said finally, not looking at any of them. "The piano room is off limits. So is the master bedroom upstairs. You don't go into the south barn without permission, and you don't ask questions about things." "That aren't your business." Emma nodded quickly. "We understand." Danny apologized to Mr. Caldwell. "I'm sorry," Danny whispered, his voice so small it barely carried across the room. "I won't touch it again." Marcus looked at the boy then, really looked at him, and Emma saw his expression falter. Danny's lower lip trembled, but he didn't cry. He'd learned long ago that tears often made things worse. Instead, he stood perfectly still, waiting for judgment. Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair. "Just don't touch it." He left without another word, and they heard the back door slam shut moments later. Danny turned to Emma, his dark eyes huge in his pale face. "Did I get us kicked out?" Emma knelt down and pulled him into her arms. "No, honey, you didn't know. It's okay." But as she held her youngest brother, Emma couldn't shake the image of Marcus's face when he'd seen Danny at the piano. It wasn't just anger, it was the look of someone who'd been struck by lightning, someone reliving a moment too painful to bear. That evening, Marcus didn't come back to the house for dinner. Emma found ingredients in the well-stocked kitchen and prepared a simple meal of scrambled eggs and toast. The siblings ate quietly at the kitchen table, glancing occasionally toward the windows where they could see lights in the distant barn. "Should we save him a plate?" Sophia asked. Emma looked out at the barn, then at the food growing cold on the stove. "I'll make him something later." But later came and went, and Marcus never appeared. When Emma finally ventured onto the back porch, around 9 o'clock, she could still see the glow of lights in the barn, could make out his silhouette moving among what looked like workshop equipment. The next morning brought their first real glimpse of ranch life. Emma woke to the sound of cattle calling and machinery starting up somewhere in the distance. By the time she made it downstairs, Marcus was already gone, though she found a note on the kitchen counter. "Store in town, list on fridge, take what you need." The refrigerator held a handwritten list of basic supplies, along with 3 $20 bills, paperclipped to the top. Emma stared at the money for a long moment. It was more cash than they'd had in months, offered without strings or lectures about being grateful. "He left us money for groceries," she told the twins when they appeared for breakfast. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "He trusts us with $60? "Apparently." The walk to town took the better part of the morning, but it was beautiful in a way that made Emma understand why someone might choose to live in such isolation. The road wound through stands of aspen trees that whispered in the breeze, past meadows where elk grazed in the early morning light. The air was clean and sharp, so different from the city smog they'd grown up breathing. Millfield turned out to be the kind of small town that existed on a single main street. One grocery store, one hardware store, a diner that had probably looked the same since 1950, and a post office that doubled as the bus depot. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noted with polite curiosity. Emma felt the attention as soon as they walked into Morrison's general store. Conversations quieted. Eyes followed their progress through the aisles. By the time they reached the checkout counter, she could practically feel the questions hanging in the air. "You must be staying out at the Caldwell place," the elderly cashier said, her tone carefully neutral. Emma nodded, focusing on unpacking. "Their cart." "Yes, ma'am. Haven't seen Marcus in town for months. How's he doing?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Emma caught the undercurrent of genuine concern. "He seems fine," she said carefully. The woman, her name tag read Dorothy, rang up their groceries with practiced efficiency. "You tell him Dorothy Morrison asked after him, will you? And that the church social is next Sunday if he'd like to come." "I'll tell him." Dorothy handed Emma the change, then hesitated. "Do you kids need anything else? Anything at all?" The kindness in her voice nearly undid Emma's careful composure. "No, ma'am. Thank you." As they walked back toward the ranch, Emma found herself wondering about Marcus Caldwell's place in this small community. Dorothy's concern had been real, not mere politeness. Whatever had happened in that house, whatever had turned it into a shrine of grief, it had touched more people than just Marcus. They arrived back at the ranch to find Marcus working in the near pasture, fixing a section of damaged fence. He looked up when he heard their footsteps on the gravel drive, his expression unreadable. "Get everything you need?" he called out. "Yes, sir," Emma replied. "Mrs. Morrison at the store asked me to tell you she said hello. And something about a church social on Sunday." Something flickered across Marcus's face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Dorothy always was persistent. He returned to his work, driving posts with methodical precision. Emma watched him for a moment, noting the easy strength in his movements, the way he handled the heavy tools as if they weighed nothing. There was something almost meditative about his work, as if the physical labor helped quiet whatever ghosts lived in his head. "Mr. Caldwell?" Emma approached the fence line carefully. He looked up, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Is there anything we can do to help? Caleb and Sophia are strong, and I learn quickly." Marcus considered this, his pale eyes moving from Emma to the twins who were hanging back by the road. "Have you ever worked with animals?" "No, sir, but we're willing to learn." He set down his post-hole digger and walked over to the fence. "Ranch work isn't easy. It's not like the movies. Animals are unpredictable. The weather doesn't care about your schedule. You get hurt, your work hurts, and you don't complain about it." "We understand," Emma said. "Do you?" Marcus's gaze was direct, challenging. "Because I've seen city kids come out here thinking ranch work is some kind of adventure. They last about a week before they're crying to go home." "We don't have a home to cry about," Sophia spoke up, her voice steady. "This is it. Whatever you need us to do, we'll do it." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of the teenage attitude he probably expected. Instead, he found the calm certainty of someone who'd learned early that survival meant adapting to whatever circumstances life threw at you. "Cattle are stupid and dangerous," he said finally. "They'll step on your foot and not notice. They'll charge if they're scared or protecting their calves. Horses will break your ribs if you're not paying attention, and if you get careless around the machinery, you'll lose fingers. Or worse." "We won't get careless," Caleb said. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "We'll start small, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs. You prove you can handle that without getting pecked to death. We'll see about something more challenging." Emma felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "Chickens it is." The chicken coop turned out to be a surprisingly elaborate structure behind the main barn, complete with nesting boxes and a fenced run that gave the birds plenty of space to roam. Marcus showed them how to approach the hens, slowly, confidently, without sudden movements that might startle them into aggressive behavior. "Roosters are the ones you watch out for," he said, indicating a magnificent bird with iridescent black and green feathers. "Chester there thinks he owns the place. He's not wrong." Danny giggled, the first genuinely happy sound Emma had heard from him in weeks. "His name is Chester." "Named after a boxer," Marcus said, and there was something almost like humor in his voice. "Fights just about as dirty." As if summoned by the conversation, Chester strutted over to investigate the newcomers. Danny immediately tried to hide behind Emma, but the rooster seemed more curious than aggressive, tilting his head to study the boy with bright, intelligent eyes. "He won't hurt you if you don't act afraid," Marcus said. "Animals sense fear, makes them either nervous or aggressive, neither of which you want." Danny took a tentative step forward, his hand outstretched. Chester regarded him solemnly for a moment, then pecked gently at his fingers, not hard enough to hurt, just investigating this small human who smelled of uncertainty and hope. "He likes me," Danny whispered in wonder. Emma watched Marcus's face as he observed the interaction. Again, that flicker of pain quickly suppressed, but this time she caught something else, a reluctant softness, as if Danny's delight was chipping away at carefully constructed walls. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of lessons: how to scatter feed so the birds didn't fight over it, how to check the nesting boxes without disturbing brooding hens, how to spot signs of illness or injury that might require attention. Marcus was a patient teacher, thorough in his explanations, quick to correct mistakes before they became dangerous habits. By evening, the siblings had settled into something that almost felt like routine. Emma prepared dinner while the twins helped Marcus with the last of the daily chores. Danny sat at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of Chester and the other chickens in a notebook he'd found in his backpack. When Marcus finally came in for supper, he paused in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene. The smell of cooking food, the sound of quiet conversation, the sight of children moving through his house as if they belonged there. Emma turned from the stove to find him watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "I hope chicken and rice is okay." "It's fine." He moved to wash his hands at the kitchen sink, his movements careful and deliberate. They ate in relative quiet, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers. Danny chattered softly about the chickens, asking questions that Marcus answered with increasing patience. The twins contributed observations about the ranch, the mountains, the way the light changed as evening approached. Emma found herself studying Marcus when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to piece together the puzzle of who he was. The careful way he spoke to Danny, as if every word required thought and effort. The gentleness of his hands when he'd shown them how to handle the eggs. The pain that lurked behind his pale eyes whenever he looked too long at any of them. After dinner, Marcus retreated to his workshop again, but this time he left the kitchen light on. Emma took it as permission to stay, to make this sterile house feel a little more like home, as she washed dishes and listened to her siblings settling into their bedtime routines upstairs. Emma allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. They'd survived their first full day. Marcus hadn't thrown them out, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, they had something that resembled stability. It wouldn't last. She knew better than to believe otherwise. But maybe, just maybe, it would last long enough for them to catch their breath, long enough to remember what it felt like to be safe. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, promising snow before morning. But the house was warm, the pantry was full, and upstairs her siblings were sleeping in real beds instead of shelters or the back seats of social workers' cars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of Marcus's reluctant hospitality. But tonight they were home, even if home came with rules and barriers, and a man who looked at them as if they were ghosts of everything he'd lost. The first snow came 3 days later, transforming the ranch into something magical. Emma woke to find the world outside her window blanketed in pristine white, the mountains sharp and brilliant against a crystalline sky. Downstairs, she could hear Marcus moving around the kitchen, the familiar sounds of coffee brewing and boots on hardwood floors. When she made it to the kitchen, she found him standing at the window, steam rising from a mug in his hands. He'd been up for hours. She could tell by the way his work clothes were already dusty, the slight weariness in his posture. "Snow came early this year," he said without turning around. Emma poured herself coffee from the pot he'd left warming. "Is that bad for the ranch? Means we need to move the cattle to winter pasture sooner than planned and check the water lines before they freeze." He glanced at her. "Are your siblings up for some real work today?" Emma nodded, though her stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. Real work meant real responsibility, which meant real chances to fail, and failure usually meant moving on. "Good. We'll start after breakfast." By the time the twins and Danny made it downstairs, Marcus had outlined their tasks for the day. The cattle needed to be moved from the high pasture to the fields closer to the ranch buildings. Water troughs needed to be checked and heated elements tested. Feed needed to be distributed to the various barns and shelters scattered across the property. "It's going to be cold," Marcus warned, looking directly at Danny, "and wet, and probably miserable. You sure you're up for it?" Danny straightened his shoulders, trying to look older than his 7 years. "I'm sure." Marcus almost smiled. Almost. The work was everything Marcus had promised, and worse. The cattle were stubborn, refusing to move in the direction they wanted them to go. The snow made footing treacherous, and more than once Emma found herself sprawled in a muddy patch that had been hidden beneath the white blanket. Danny struggled to keep up with the longer legs of the adults, but he never complained, even when his lips turned blue with cold. It was Caleb who surprised them all. The quiet twin seemed to have an instinctive understanding of how the cattle moved, how to position himself to guide them without spooking them. Marcus noticed too, Emma could tell, watching the boy work with something like approval. "You've done this before," Marcus said during a brief rest, leaning against the fence. As they caught their breath, Caleb shook his head. "Just makes sense, I guess. They want to stay together, so you work with that instead of against it. Most people try to force them. Doesn't work." "Most people try to force everything," Sophia muttered, and Emma caught the bitter edge in her voice. Marcus looked at her sharply. "That was your experience?" Sophia shrugged, but Emma saw the way her jaw tightened. "People always think they know what's best for you. It doesn't matter what you want or need." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. Marcus studied Sophia's face, and Emma wondered what he saw there. The same careful walls they'd all learned to build, the same weary expectation of disappointment. "Animals are honest," Marcus said finally. "They don't pretend to care about you when they don't make promises they can't keep." "Sounds nice," Sophia said, but some of the edge had left her voice. They finished moving the cattle by midday, and Marcus declared a lunch break. Emma was grateful. Her fingers were numb despite the work gloves Marcus had found for them, and she could see that Danny was reaching the end of his endurance. But instead of heading back to the house, Marcus led them to the main barn, where he'd set up a propane heater and a makeshift table from sawhorses and plywood. "Can't waste time going back and forth," he explained, pulling sandwiches and thermoses of coffee from a cooler. "Weather like this, you eat when you can." The barn was warmer than outside, and the smell of hay and leather was somehow comforting. Danny climbed onto a hay bale and swung his legs, finally allowing some of his exhaustion to show. "My feet are cold," he admitted quietly. Marcus looked at the boy's worn sneakers, noting the gaps where the sole had separated from the upper. Without a word, he disappeared into what appeared to be a tack room and returned with a pair of small work boots. "These might fit," he said, kneeling down in front of Danny. Emma held her breath. She'd seen Danny reject help before, too proud and too hurt to accept kindness that might be taken away without warning. But something about Marcus's matter-of-fact approach seemed to bypass the boy's defenses. "Where did these come from?" Emma asked as Marcus helped Danny lace up the boots. Marcus's hands stilled for just a moment, had them lying around. The boots were well made but obviously used, worn soft in places that spoke of long hours of active wear. They fit Danny perfectly, as if they'd been made for his feet. "Better?" Marcus asked, standing up. Danny nodded, bouncing slightly to test the boots. "Much better. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." Again, that almost smile flickered across Marcus's features. "Can't you get frostbite on my watch?" The afternoon brought new challenges. A section of fence had been damaged by a fallen tree, requiring repairs that demanded both strength and precision. Marcus showed them how to dig post holes in ground that was already starting to freeze, how to stretch wire tight enough to hold but not so tight it would snap in the wind. Emma found herself working beside Marcus, holding posts steady while he drove them into the hard earth. Up close, she could see the lines etched by years of sun and weather, the scars on his hands that spoke of decades of hard work. There was something almost meditative about his movements, as if the physical labor helped quiet whatever storms raged in his head. "How long have you lived here?" she asked during a brief break. 15 years. The answer came without hesitation, but Emma caught the way his jaw tightened. "Did you grow up on a ranch?" "No." This time the word was clipped, final. A door closing. Emma didn't push. She'd learned to read the signs of conversations that were over before they'd really begun. Instead, she focused on the work, on the satisfaction of seeing the fence take shape under their combined efforts. It was Sophia who found the photograph. They'd moved into the tack room to organize tools, and Sophia had been looking for a specific wrench when she knocked over a dusty box tucked behind some bridles. Papers scattered across the floor, and as they rushed to gather them up, a photograph fluttered face up near Sophia's feet. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma found herself staring at the image of a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting on a horse with Marcus, a younger Marcus with darker hair and eyes that hadn't yet learned to hold such careful emptiness. The boy was laughing at something off camera, his face bright with joy, and Marcus's arm was wrapped around him protectively. "Put it back." Marcus's voice cut through the silence like ice. Sophia scrambled to retrieve the photograph, but the damage was done. They all saw the way Marcus's hands shook as he took it from her, the way he clutched it against his chest, as if it were made of spun glass. "I'm sorry," Sophia whispered. "I didn't mean to—" "Just put everything back." Marcus's voice was barely controlled. "Now." They worked in silence to gather the scattered papers, nobody daring to look too closely at what else had been in that box. Emma caught glimpses, official-looking documents, what might have been medical records, more photographs that Marcus snatched away before anyone could see them clearly. When everything was back in the box, Marcus shoved it deep behind the bridles and saddles where it had been hidden. His breathing was harsh in the quiet of the tack room, and Emma could see the rigid control it was taking for him to hold himself together. "We should head back," he said finally, not meeting anyone's eyes. The walk to the house was subdued. Danny, exhausted from the day's work, leaned heavily against Emma's side. The twins moved with the careful quiet they'd perfected during their years in the system, the silence of children who'd learned that sometimes the safest thing to do was become invisible. But Marcus's silence was different. It was the silence of someone wrestling with ghosts, of painful memories dragged unwillingly into the light. That evening, dinner was a stilted affair. Marcus ate mechanically, responding to direct questions with single words when he responded at all. Danny tried once to tell a story about Chester the rooster, but even his innocent chatter seemed to bounce off the walls Marcus had rebuilt around himself. Emma found herself studying his face, trying to piece together the fragments of story the photograph had revealed. A son, clearly. A boy who'd lived in this house, played in these rooms, worn the boots that now kept Danny's feet warm. And something had happened to him, something that had turned Marcus from the laughing man in the photograph to the hollow-eyed stranger who sat across from them now. After dinner, Marcus disappeared to his workshop again, but this time Emma could hear the sound of power tools, aggressive and unrelenting. He was building something or tearing something apart. Either way, it sounded like violence channeled into wood and metal. Emma was washing dishes when Danny appeared beside her, tugging on her sleeve. "Em, is Mr. Caldwell mad at us?" Emma dried her hands and knelt down to Danny's level. "No, honey, he's not mad at us." "Then why is he sad?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it took Emma's breath away. Danny had always been perceptive, able to see through the lies adults told to make difficult truths easier to swallow. "Sometimes grown-ups have sad things that happened to them before," Emma said carefully. "And sometimes seeing new people or new things reminds them of those sad things." Danny considered this, his young face serious. "Like when you get sad about Mama and Papa." Emma felt her throat close. Their parents had died in a car accident 3 years ago, launching them into the maze of foster care and temporary placements that had brought them to this remote ranch. "Yeah," she managed. "Like that." Danny nodded solemnly. "Maybe we should be extra nice to him, so he knows we're not scary." "I think that's a good idea." But as Emma tucked Danny into bed that night, she wondered if kindness would be enough. Marcus Caldwell was carrying a pain so deep it had changed the fundamental architecture of his life. He'd built this fortress of solitude not to keep the world out, but to keep his grief in, and they, four broken children looking for a place to belong, were a daily reminder of everything he'd lost. Emma lay awake long after the house had settled, into quiet, listening to the sounds of Marcus still working in his shop. Through her window, she could see the glow of lights, could make out his silhouette moving restlessly among his tools and projects. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding layer upon layer to the blanket that covered the ranch. By morning, the roads would probably be impassable, trapping them all together in this house full of secrets and sorrow. Emma pulled her blankets closer and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to the photograph, to the joy on that little boy's face, and the way Marcus had held him as if he were the most precious thing in the world. What had happened to that child? And what would happen to them when Marcus decided that the pain of their presence was too much to bear? The questions followed her into restless dreams, where she found herself searching through an endless house full of covered furniture and locked doors, looking for answers that stayed just out of reach. In her dreams, she could hear piano music, a child's melody, simple and sweet, but every time she thought she'd found the source, the music would stop, leaving her alone in the silence of a house that held its secrets too close to share. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of Marcus's resolve to keep them at arm's length. Emma could only hope that whatever walls he'd built around his heart, they weren't strong enough to keep out four children who had nowhere else to go. The call came at dawn, cutting through the mountain silence like a blade. Emma bolted upright. At the sound of Marcus's phone ringing downstairs, followed by his terse voice answering, she could hear only fragments through the floorboards, words like emergency and county road, and something that sounded like evacuation. Within minutes, heavy footsteps were climbing the stairs, and Marcus's voice was calling their names. "Get dressed, now. We need to move." Emma found him in the hallway, already pulling on his heavy coat. His face was grim in the pre-dawn darkness, and she felt her stomach drop with familiar dread. Emergency calls, in their experience, usually meant one thing: they were being moved again. "What's happening?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Forest fire jumped the containment lines. About 20 miles south. Winds pushing it this direction, and with all the snow melting off, the ground's too wet for the firefighting equipment to get through. Marcus was moving with practiced efficiency, checking windows, grabbing supplies from a hall closet. Sheriffs, recommending voluntary evacuation for everyone in the valley. Caleb appeared in his doorway, instantly alert, despite being woken from deep sleep. "Are we leaving?" Marcus paused, and Emma caught something complicated crossing his face. "We're going to prepare for the possibility. Get your things together, just essentials, and wake Danny, but try not to scare him." As her siblings scrambled to pack, Emma followed Marcus downstairs. Through the kitchen window, she could see an orange glow on the horizon that definitely hadn't been there the night before, and the air carried a faint smell of smoke that made her chest tighten with anxiety. "How much time do we have?" she asked. Marcus was loading supplies into boxes with military precision: bottled water, canned goods, first aid kit, flashlights. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be longer. Depends on the wind." Emma began helping, without being asked, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced. If they had to evacuate, where would they go? The social services office was closed on weekends. They had no other family, no emergency contacts beyond Mrs. Henderson, who was probably dealing with dozens of other cases. Marcus? The sound of his first name leaving her lips surprised them both. "What happens to us if we have to leave?" He looked up from the box he was packing, and she saw her own question reflected in his eyes. The sudden realization that evacuation wasn't just about leaving the ranch. It was about what came after. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. By the time the sun rose fully, the smoke smell had grown stronger, and they could see helicopters in the distance, carrying water to dump on the advancing flames. Marcus made them breakfast, but nobody ate much. The radio crackled with updates from emergency services, each report seeming more urgent than the last. "Caldwell Ranch, this is Sheriff Morrison. You copy?" Marcus grabbed the radio handset. "I'm here, Tom. Marcus, we're recommending immediate evacuation for your sector. Fire's moving faster than we anticipated, and the wind's shifting. Can you be ready to move in 30 minutes? Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for Marcus's response. 30 minutes to pack up their entire temporary life, to prepare for another disruption, another unknown destination. "Copy that, Tom. We'll be ready." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Boxes were loaded into Marcus's truck with mechanical efficiency. Emma made sure her siblings had their few precious belongings: Danny's notebook of chicken drawings, Sophia's worn copy of Jane Eyre, Caleb's collection of interesting rocks from their various placements. But it was Marcus who surprised her most. As he moved through the house, she watched him gather specific items with careful deliberation. A photograph from the mantelpiece that she hadn't noticed before, a wooden box from his bedroom, and finally, moving slowly as if his feet weighed 1,000 pounds, he approached the covered piano. For a moment, he just stood there, his hand resting on the white sheet. Then, with infinite gentleness, he lifted the cover and pressed a single key. The same key Danny had touched days before. The note hung in the air, pure and heartbreaking. "Come on, Dad. Play the song about the mountains." The voice was Danny's, but the words were wrong, spoken as if he were someone else, somewhere else. Emma turned to find her youngest brother standing in the doorway, his face oddly vacant, as if he were seeing through different eyes. Marcus went rigid. "What did you say?" Danny blinked, confusion clearing from his features. I don't know. I was thinking about the piano, and suddenly I heard..." He trailed off, looking scared. "Did I say something wrong?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Marcus's face had gone completely white, and Emma could see his hands trembling where they gripped the piano bench. "We need to go," Marcus said finally, his voice hollow. "Now, the evacuation." Center was set up in the high school gymnasium in the next county over, a sprawling space filled with cots and Red Cross volunteers and the displaced residents of the entire valley. Emma had been in similar places before, during natural disasters that had disrupted their previous placements. The combination of chaos and institutional charity was depressingly familiar. But Marcus seemed lost in a way that had nothing to do with the emergency. He moved through the check-in process mechanically, answering questions with single-word responses, his eyes holding that same empty quality she'd first seen when they'd arrived at his door. They were assigned cots in a corner of the gymnasium, 4 small beds in a row that emphasized their temporary provisional status. Danny climbed onto his cot and immediately curled up with his notebook, seeking comfort in familiar routines. The twins sat on their respective beds, watching the controlled chaos around them with the careful attention of children who'd learned to read the moods of unfamiliar places. Emma found herself watching Marcus, who stood beside his cot as if he'd forgotten what it was for. Around them, families clustered together, sharing snacks and reassurances. But Marcus seemed isolated even in the crowded space. "Mr. Caldwell." A woman's voice cut through the gymnasium noise. "Marcus Caldwell?" They turned to see a middle-aged woman approaching, her face lighting up with recognition. She was well-dressed despite the circumstances, with graying hair and the kind of purposeful stride that suggested authority. "Janet Holbrook," she said, extending her hand to Marcus. "I'm the county social services supervisor. I've been looking for you." Emma felt the bottom drop out of her world. Social services, here, now. When everything was already falling apart, Marcus accepted the handshake with visible reluctance. Ms. Holbrook, I understand you've been caring for the Rodriguez children? Janet's tone was professionally pleasant, but Emma caught the undercurrent of concern. There seems to have been some confusion about their placement. We have no record of you being approved for emergency foster care. The words hit like physical blows. Emma saw Sophia stiffen, saw Caleb's face go carefully blank, saw Danny look up from his notebook with a growing alarm. There was a miscommunication, Marcus said carefully. They showed up with paperwork saying I'd agreed to temporary placement. Janet nodded, making notes on a clipboard. Yes, we've identified the error. A new caseworker misread the files and sent them to you instead of the approved placement in Denver. She looked at the 4 siblings with practiced sympathy. I'm sorry for the confusion, children. We'll get this sorted out. Sorted out how? Emma managed to ask, though her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Well, we'll need to make alternative arrangements, of course. Mr. Caldwell isn't licensed for foster care, and with the emergency situation, we need to ensure you're in a safe, approved environment. Emma felt the familiar crushing weight of disappointment settling on her shoulders. Of course this had all been a mistake. The temporary haven, the careful hope she'd begun to nurture, the growing sense that maybe, just maybe, they'd found somewhere to belong. All of it built on an error in paperwork. Where will we go? Caleb asked quietly. Janet consulted her clipboard. I'm working on that. The Denver placement is full now, but we have several other options. There's a group home in Colorado Springs that might have space. Group home. The words echoed in Emma's head like a death sentence. She'd heard about group homes from other kids in the system. Overcrowded, understaffed, temporary warehouses for children nobody wanted. They can't be separated, Marcus said suddenly. Janet looked up from her notes. I'm sorry. The children. They can't be separated. They're siblings. Of course, we always try to keep family units together when possible, but sometimes, no. Marcus's voice had taken on an edge Emma had never heard before. Not sometimes. They stay together. Janet's expression grew cautious. Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your concern, but these decisions need to be made by qualified professionals who understand the complexities of child placement. I understand that they've been through 7 placements in the past year. Marcus's pale eyes were fixed on Janet with laser intensity. I understand that Emma hasn't slept through the night since they arrived because she's too busy worrying about her siblings. I understand that Danny hasn't had a stable home since he was 4 years old. And Sophia thinks every adult is going to disappoint her because that's been her experience. Emma stared at him in shock. She hadn't realized he'd noticed so much, had been paying such careful attention to the small signs of their shared trauma. And I understand, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, that breaking them up now would be the cruelest thing you could do to 4 kids who've already lost everything that mattered to them. Janet's expression softened slightly. Mr. Caldwell, I can see you care about these children, but caring isn't enough. There are legal requirements, background checks, home studies. Then let's do them. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Emma felt her heart stop beating entirely. I'm sorry, Janet said. Marcus looked at the 4 siblings, taking in their faces, Emma's shock, the twins' carefully controlled hope, Danny's wide-eyed confusion. When he spoke again, his voice was steady and sure. Let's do the checks. Home study. Whatever you need. I want to apply for emergency foster placement. The gymnasium noise seemed to fade to a distant hum. Emma could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the careful walls she'd built around her hopes beginning to crack. Mr. Caldwell, Janet said slowly, Foster care isn't a decision to make lightly. These children have complex needs, and you'd be taking on significant responsibility. I know exactly what I'd be taking on. Marcus's gaze moved to Danny, who was clutching his notebook like a lifeline. And I know what happens to kids who get shuffled from place to place, never knowing where they'll wake up next month. Janet studied his face, clearly trying to assess his sincerity. This is quite a change from someone who, according to our records, has had no contact with our department for 15 years. Emma saw Marcus flinch slightly at the time reference, saw the shadow cross his features, but he didn't back down. People change, he said simply. Situations change. Janet was quiet for a long moment, weighing options Emma couldn't begin to guess at. Around them, the evacuation center continued its organized chaos, but their small corner had become an island of suspended possibility. The process isn't simple, Janet said finally. Background checks can take weeks. Home studies require multiple visits, and there's no guarantee of approval, I understand. And in the meantime, the children would need temporary placement. How temporary? Emma found her voice. Janet looked at her with something like respect. If Mr. Caldwell is serious about this, and if his preliminary checks come back clean, we might be able to arrange supervised temporary custody while the full evaluation is completed. But it would mean living under departmental oversight, regular check-ins, and strict guidelines. Marcus nodded without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Emma felt tears she hadn't realized she was holding back start to spill down her cheeks. Beside her, she saw Sophia quickly wipe her eyes, and Danny had abandoned his notebook entirely to stare at Marcus with something approaching awe. "We'll need to start the paperwork immediately," Janet said, pulling out her phone. "And Mr. Caldwell, I need you to understand that this process can be emotionally challenging. The department will want to know about your history, your motivations, and your ability to provide a stable environment for 4 children who've experienced significant trauma." Marcus's jaw tightened, and Emma caught another glimpse of the pain he kept carefully hidden. "I understand." As Janet walked away to make her calls, Marcus turned to face the 4 siblings. For a moment, nobody spoke. The weight of what had just happened, the magnitude of the commitment Marcus had just made, seemed too large for words. Finally, Danny slipped off his cot and walked over to Marcus. Without saying anything, he wrapped his small arms around Marcus's waist and held on tight. Marcus stood perfectly still for a heartbeat. Then, slowly, carefully, as if he were handling something infinitely precious and fragile, he placed his hands on Danny's shoulders. "Are you sure?" Emma asked quietly, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed. Marcus looked at each of them in turn, Emma with her fierce protectiveness, the twins with their careful walls beginning to crack. Danny clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a shifting world. "I'm sure," he said, and for the first time since they'd known him, his voice held no shadows, no hesitation. Outside, the forest fire continued to rage, consuming everything in its path. But in the crowded gymnasium, surrounded by other displaced families, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years of bouncing between temporary homes. She felt like they might finally be heading towards somewhere permanent, somewhere safe, somewhere that might eventually feel like home. 3 weeks later, the fire was out, the ranch was intact, and Janet Holbrook sat at Marcus's kitchen table, reviewing a thick manila folder that would determine their future. Emma stood at the stove, preparing lunch with movements that had become automatic over their weeks of supervised temporary placement. The routine felt almost normal now. Marcus working the ranch, the siblings attending the small local school, Janet making her weekly visits to assess their family integration progress. But underneath the surface normalcy, tension hummed like A live wire. Today was decision day. The background check came back clean, Janet said, scanning through pages of official documents. Character references from your neighbors are overwhelmingly positive. Dorothy Morrison had some particularly glowing things to say about your integrity. Marcus sat across from her, his coffee mug untouched, his face carefully neutral. Emma had learned to read the subtle signs of his anxiety, the way his fingers drummed silently on the table, the slight tightness around his eyes. However, Janet continued, and Emma felt her stomach drop. There was always a however. There are some concerns about your lack of experience with children, particularly children who've experienced trauma. I'm learning, Marcus said quietly. Yes, and that's evident in my observations. But Emma, in particular, has taken on responsibilities that exceed what we'd normally expect from a 16-year-old. She's functioning more as a co-parent than a child herself. Emma turned from the stove, her cheeks burning. That's not Marcus's fault. I've always... Emma. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. Let Ms. Holbrook finish. Janet made a note on her clipboard. Emma, your protectiveness of your siblings is admirable, but part of successful placement means allowing the adults to handle adult responsibilities. You should be worried about homework and friends, not whether there's enough food in the house or if the utility bills are paid. The criticism stung because it was true. Emma had been so focused on proving they wouldn't be a burden that she'd tried to manage everything herself. Old habits forged in 7 failed placements were hard to break. That said, Janet continued, I've seen remarkable progress in all 4 children. Danny's nightmares have virtually stopped. The twins are engaged in school for the first time in months. And Emma, despite shouldering too much responsibility, shows signs of beginning to trust that the adults in her life will follow through on their commitments. Through the kitchen window, Emma could see Danny in the pasture, sitting cross-legged in the grass, while Chester the rooster strutted nearby. It was a sight that would have been unimaginable 3 weeks ago, her anxious, traumatized little brother completely at peace with himself and his surroundings. The children clearly want to stay here, Janet said. The question is whether this placement serves their best interests long-term. What do you need from me? Marcus asked. Janet studied his face with the practiced assessment of someone who'd made these decisions hundreds of times. Honestly, I need to understand why you're doing this. You've lived alone for 15 years. You've built a life based on solitude and minimal human contact. Now you're volunteering to raise 4 children, including a teenager who's never learned to depend on adults and a 7-year-old who wakes up asking for his dead parents. The kitchen fell silent, except for the bubbling of soup on the stove. Emma held her breath, waiting for Marcus's response. In all their conversations over the past weeks, he'd never directly addressed the question of motivation. Marcus was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I had a son. The words hung in the air like a confession. Emma saw Janet's expression shift from professional assessment to human compassion. His name was Tyler. He would have been 22 this year. Emma felt her heart clench. The boy in the photograph, the boots Danny now wore, the piano that nobody was allowed to touch. All the pieces suddenly formed a picture of devastating loss. Tyler loved music, Marcus continued, his gaze fixed on his untouched coffee. Piano, mostly, but he could make music out of anything. Spent hours at that old upright, making up songs about the mountains and the animals. Used to beg me to sing along, even though I couldn't carry a tune if my life depended on it. Janet waited, her pen still against her notepad. He died when he was 7, leukemia. 3 years of treatments, specialists, false hopes. I thought money could fix anything, so I threw everything I had at the problem. Sold half the ranch, mortgaged the rest. None of it mattered in the end. Emma felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She thought of Danny, 7 years old and small for his age, with his quick smile and gentle heart. The resemblance wasn't physical. Tyler had been fair when Danny was dark, but the age, the innocence, the way they both seemed to find joy in simple things. After the funeral, I couldn't... Marcus's voice cracked slightly. I couldn't be around children anymore. Every laugh reminded me of his laugh. Every game reminded me of games we'd played. I packed away his things, covered the piano, and told myself I was protecting what was left of him. And now? Janet asked gently. Marcus looked up, his pale eyes, finding Emma's across the kitchen. Now I realize I wasn't protecting his memory. I was burying it. These children, they don't replace Tyler, and I'm not trying to replace their parents. But they've brought something back to life in this house, something I thought was gone forever. He stood up and walked to the window, where Danny could be seen in the pasture, now lying on his back in the grass, staring up at the clouds. Yesterday, Danny asked me to teach him to play piano, not because he knew about Tyler, but because he heard one of Tyler's songs in his head. The same melody Tyler used to play about the mountains. Emma's breath caught. The strange moment during the evacuation, when Danny had spoken as if he were someone else, the way he'd been drawn to the piano from the first day, the boots that fit perfectly as if they'd been waiting for him. I don't claim to understand it, Marcus said, still watching Danny through the window. But I've learned that some things don't need to be understood to be accepted. Tyler's gone, and nothing will bring him back. But maybe he'd want his piano to make music again. Maybe he'd want this house to be filled with the sound of children's voices. Janet was quiet for a long moment, processing not just Marcus's words but the emotion behind them. Emma could see her weighing professional protocols against human reality, trying to balance the needs of 4 traumatized children against the unconventional circumstances of their placement. Mr. Caldwell, Janet said finally, what you're describing sounds more like healing than substitution. But I need to know that you understand the commitment you're making. These children may be with you for years. Emma will need support through her remaining teenage years and college applications. The twins are entering high school with their own set of challenges. And Danny may always carry the trauma of losing his parents at such a young age. I understand. There will be therapy appointments, school conferences, medical emergencies, teenage rebellion, heartbreaks, and celebrations. There will be times when you question every decision, and times when you'll wonder if you're doing more harm than good. Marcus nodded. I'm already wondering that. Janet almost smiled. That's actually a good sign. Parents who are certain they're doing everything right usually aren't. Emma felt a flutter of hope. Janet's tone had shifted from assessment to acceptance, from professional distance to something approaching approval. The state requires ongoing support services for high-risk placements like this one, Janet continued. Monthly check-ins for the first year, family therapy to help everyone adjust, and educational support to help the children catch up academically. Whatever you think is necessary. Janet closed the manila folder with a definitive snap. In that case, I'm recommending approval for permanent placement. Congratulations, Mr. Caldwell. You're about to become the legal guardian of 4 children. Emma's knees went weak with relief. Across the kitchen, she heard Sophia's sharp intake of breath from the doorway where she and Caleb had been listening. Through the window, Danny seemed oblivious to the life-changing conversation happening inside, still cloud-watching with Chester as his companion. There's paperwork to finalize, Janet said, standing and gathering her files, and you'll need to think about things like college funds and life insurance. But as of today, the Rodriguez children have a permanent home. As Janet's car disappeared, down the gravel drive, the 5 of them stood in the kitchen, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. After months of uncertainty, years of temporary placements, a lifetime of feeling unwanted. They finally had something that couldn't be taken away by bureaucratic errors or overcrowding or budget cuts. They had a family. "So," Marcus said, his voice carefully casual, "who wants to help me uncover that piano?" Danny's whoop of joy could probably be heard in the next county. As they gathered around the old upright in the living room, Marcus's hands shook slightly as he lifted the dust cover. The piano was beautiful, mahogany wood polished to a warm glow, keys that had been carefully maintained despite years of silence. "Play something," Danny demanded, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Marcus sat down on the bench, his fingers hovering over the keys as if he were approaching something sacred. "I'm not very good," he warned. "Tyler didn't care if you were good," Emma said softly, and Marcus looked at her with surprise and gratitude. He pressed a single key, then another, and slowly, tentatively, a simple melody began to emerge. It was hesitant at first, rusty from years of disuse, but gradually it gained confidence and strength. Danny climbed onto the bench beside Marcus, his small fingers finding harmonies as if he'd been playing his entire life. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a song about mountains and home and the courage it takes to love again after loss. Emma found herself crying again, but these were different tears, not the tears of disappointment and fear she'd shed so many times before, but tears of overwhelming gratitude for the man who'd opened his door to 4 strangers and found the strength to open his heart as well. As the music filled the house, Tyler's house, their house, Emma thought about all the homes they'd tried to find over the past 3 years, foster families who'd seen them as charity cases, group homes that had treated them like inventory, social workers who'd shuffled them from placement to placement like pieces in a puzzle that never quite fit. None of them had understood what Emma understood now. That home wasn't a place you found. It was something you built, one small act of courage at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of choosing love over fear, again and again, until the choosing became natural and the love became real. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood, eternal and unchanging, their peaks touched with snow that would melt and return with the seasons. But inside the old ranch house, something new was being born, a family forged not by blood or law, but by the simple recognition that they belonged together. Marcus played, and Danny harmonized, and the twins sat on the old couch, listening to music that seemed to heal something broken in all of them. Emma stood in the doorway, watching the scene with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. They were home. Finally, impossibly, completely home. And in the melody that danced through the air, Emma could swear she heard another voice joining. In a child's voice, sweet and clear, welcoming them to a house that had been waiting far too long to be filled with laughter and music and the messy, beautiful chaos of family. Tyler's song had become their song. Tyler's home had become their home, and Marcus Caldwell, the bitter, broken man who'd answered his door 3 weeks ago planning to turn them away, had become the father they'd never dared to hope they might find. The music played on, carrying promises of tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, in a house that finally understood the difference between simply existing and truly being alive. The graduation cap sat crooked on Emma's head as she adjusted it for the 3rd time in the mirror. 18 years old, valedictorian of Millfield High School's class of 12 students, and still fussing with her appearance like she was 7 instead of on her way to Colorado State University on a full academic scholarship. "Em, you look perfect," Sophia called from the doorway, rolling her eyes with the practiced exasperation of a 15-year-old sister. "Besides, it's not like anyone's going to be looking at your hat when you're giving the speech." Emma turned from the mirror, taking in Sophia's transformation over the past 2 years. Gone was the bitter, guarded 13-year-old who'd arrived at the ranch expecting disappointment. In her place stood a confident teenager who'd found her voice in the school's drama club and was already talking about studying theater in college. "Dad, nervous?" Emma asked, the word dad still feeling wonderful and strange on her tongue even after 2 years of practice. "Terrified," Sophia grinned. "Caleb found him in the barn this morning, talking to the cattle about how proud he is." "The cattle seemed very impressed." Emma laughed, the sound echoing off the walls of what had once been Tyler's room and was now hers. Marcus had offered it to her on her 17th birthday, saying it was time for the biggest room to belong to the oldest child. She'd been hesitant at first, worried about disturbing Tyler's memory, but Marcus had insisted. Tyler would have wanted his room to be lived in, he'd said simply, not preserved like a museum. Now the room was a comfortable blend of Tyler's. Childhood treasures. The wooden toy chest now held Emma's college textbooks. The dinosaur books shared shelf space with her psychology and education materials and her own belongings. The college acceptance letters were framed on the wall next to a photo of Tyler that Marcus had finally felt strong enough to display. Downstairs, Emma could hear the sounds of controlled chaos that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Danny practiced his piano piece for the graduation ceremony. At 9 years old, he was already more accomplished than most adult players. Caleb argued with Marcus about whether his graduation outfit required a tie. The sound of something dropping in the kitchen, followed by Chester's indignant squawking, yes, Chester still lived in the house. It had started as a temporary arrangement during a particularly harsh winter, but the rooster had simply never left, establishing himself as the family's unofficial mascot and Danny's closest confidant. Emma made her way downstairs, stepping over Chester, who had claimed the bottom step as his personal throne. In the kitchen, she found Marcus standing over the sink, scrubbing his hands with the methodical intensity he brought to everything these days. 2 years of parenting had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened into laugh lines. His hair was completely grey now, but his posture spoke of a man who'd found purpose instead of just existing. "Dad, you know you've been washing your hands for 5 minutes, right?" Marcus looked down at his hands, as if surprised to find them under running water. "Right. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. About a high school graduation. About my daughter giving the valedictorian speech to the entire town." He dried his hands and turned to face her, his expression soft with pride and anxiety. "What if I mess something up? What if I'm supposed to do something I don't know about?" Emma felt her heart squeeze with affection. Marcus Caldwell, who could handle a 1,000-pound bull without breaking a sweat, who'd rebuilt their barn after the tornado last spring, who'd sat by her bedside for 3 days when she'd had pneumonia. This man was worried about graduation protocol. "Dad, you've gotten me through the last 2 years of high school, helped me with college applications, and managed to keep 3 teenagers and a 9-year-old alive and reasonably sane. I think you can handle a graduation ceremony." Marcus smiled, but Emma could still see the uncertainty in his eyes. Parenting came more naturally to him now, but the fear of making mistakes, of somehow failing them, never completely disappeared. "Besides," Emma added, "Dorothy Morrison is organizing everything. You know nothing goes wrong when Dorothy's in charge." That earned her a genuine laugh. Dorothy Morrison had appointed herself the family's unofficial grandmother from the moment. Marcus had started the adoption process. She'd shown up with casseroles during the transition period and had never really stopped coming. Her presence had been a bridge between Marcus's self-imposed isolation and the community he'd shut out for 15 years. "Danny, time to go!" Marcus called up the stairs. "Coming!" Danny's voice drifted down, followed by the sound of piano keys. He was playing while he got dressed, a skill he'd developed that both amazed and occasionally frustrated his family. Emma watched Marcus straighten his tie in the hallway mirror, He was wearing the same suit he'd worn to Tyler's funeral 16 years ago, but today it looked different on him. Then it had been armor against a world that had taken everything from him. Today, it was simply a father's attempt to look presentable for his daughter's graduation. "You know," Emma said carefully, "Tyler would be proud of you too." Marcus's hands stilled on his tie. Over the past 2 years, they'd learned to talk about Tyler naturally, to include his memory in their daily lives without the crushing weight of grief that had once made his name unspoken. But moments like this still required delicacy. "You think so? I know so. You saved 4 kids who had nowhere else to go. You learned to be a father to children who weren't even yours. And you filled his house with exactly the kind of love he would have wanted it to hold." Marcus turned from the mirror, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "How did you get so wise at 18? "I learned from watching someone who figured out how to let love be stronger than loss." The graduation ceremony was held in the high school auditorium, which had been decorated with the kind of enthusiastic, if amateur, flair that small towns did best. The entire population of Millfield seemed to be in attendance, along with relatives from the surrounding counties. Emma spotted Janet Holbrook in the 3rd row, beaming with the pride of someone who'd made the right call under difficult circumstances. As valedictorian, Emma was the final speaker before the diplomas were awarded. She'd written and rewritten her speech dozens of times, trying to find words that would capture what the last 2 years had meant, not just to her, but to her entire family. Standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of familiar faces, Emma felt the weight of the moment. Somewhere in the audience, Marcus was probably gripping his program hard enough to wrinkle it. Danny was likely swinging his legs in his chair, trying to sit still through a ceremony he was still too young to fully understand. The twins were undoubtedly texting each other sarcastic comments about their classmates' outfits. 2 years ago," Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I thought I knew what family meant. I thought it was about sharing. DNA, about being related by blood, about having the same last name." She paused, letting her gaze find Marcus in the audience. He was sitting in the 2nd row, flanked by her siblings, his face a mixture of pride and anxiety. "I was wrong," she continued. "Family isn't about where you come from. It's about who shows up. It's about who stays when things get difficult. It's about who chooses to love you, not because they have to, but because they want to." Emma saw Dorothy, Morrison wiping her eyes with a tissue. Several other people in the audience were doing the same. Some of us in this graduating class were lucky enough to be born into families that understood this from the beginning. Others of us had to learn it the hard way, through loss and disappointment and the kind of fear that comes from never knowing where you'll be sleeping next month. The auditorium was completely silent now, everyone hanging on her words. "But here's what I've learned. It doesn't matter how your family is formed. What matters is what you do with it once you have it. My father," Emma's voice caught slightly on the word, "taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." She could see Marcus sitting up straighter in his chair, his expression shifting from anxiety to something approaching awe. He was afraid to let us into his house because he'd already lost the most important person in his world, and he didn't think his heart could survive losing anyone else. But he let us in anyway, because sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. Emma took a breath, steadying herself for the most important part of her speech. "To my classmates who are heading off to college, to jobs, to whatever comes next, remember that home isn't a place you leave behind. It's something you carry with you, and if you're lucky, really lucky, it's also something you can always come back to." She looked directly at Marcus. "Dad, thank you for teaching me that family is a verb, not a noun. Thank you for showing me that love multiplies rather than divides, and that there's always room for one more around your table." The applause was thunderous. Emma could see people throughout the audience wiping their eyes, and she caught sight of Marcus, who wasn't even trying to hide his tears. After the ceremony, after the photographs and congratulations and promises to keep in touch, the family gathered on the ranch house porch as the sun set behind the mountains. Emma still wore her cap and gown, though she'd kicked off the uncomfortable dress shoes in favor of her old boots. "So," Marcus said, settling into the porch swing with a cup of coffee, "Colorado State University. You sure about your major?" Emma nodded. "Elementary education, with a focus on children who've experienced trauma. I want to be the teacher I needed when I was younger." "And the minor in music therapy?" That was Danny's idea, actually. Emma smiled at her youngest brother, who was sitting on the porch steps with Chester in his lap. "He thinks music can heal people the way it healed us." Marcus looked at Danny with the expression of wonder that still crossed his face sometimes, when he realized how much wisdom lived in that small body. "What do you think, kiddo? You going to be a music therapist too?" Danny considered this seriously. "Maybe, or maybe I'll be a veterinarian who plays piano for sick animals. Chester thinks that would be a good job." Caleb snorted with laughter. "Chester thinks eating Emma's homework would be a good idea. I wouldn't trust his career advice." "Hey!" Danny protested, while Chester ruffled his feathers indignantly. Emma watched her family's familiar dynamic with the contentment that came from knowing this would always be here for her. College would be an adventure, and she was excited about the independence and challenges it would bring, but she also knew that no matter where life took her, she would always have this, a place where she belonged unconditionally, people who chose to love her every single day. "You know what I realized during your speech," Sophia said, curling up in the porch chair she'd claimed as her own 2 summers ago. "What's that?" "Tyler's still here." "Not like ghost here," Sophia added quickly, seeing the adults' expressions, "but his love is still here. In the music lessons Dad gives Danny, in the way Dad worries about us the same way he must have worried about Tyler, in the fact that this house is full of kids again." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You know, I spent 15 years thinking that keeping Tyler's memory meant keeping everything exactly the way he left it. But memories aren't preserved by avoiding them. They're kept alive by living them." Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever they talked about Tyler directly. Not sadness exactly, but a recognition of the profound loss that had made their family possible. "Do you think he would have liked us?" Danny asked quietly. Marcus didn't hesitate. "I think he would have loved you, all of you, and I think he would have been excited to have brothers and a sister." As if summoned by the conversation, the wind chimes that hung from the porch eaves began to sing softly in the evening breeze. They'd been Tyler's, purchased at a craft fair the summer before he died, and Marcus had finally felt strong enough to hang them again last spring. The sound was peaceful, melodic, like a gentle benediction on the conversation. Emma found herself thinking about all the ways love persisted beyond loss, how Tyler's presence had become part of their family story, not as a shadow, but as a blessing. "Dad," Emma said as the evening deepened around them. "Yeah, thank you. For all of it. For taking us in when you didn't want to. For learning to be our father when you didn't know how. For letting Tyler's memory be part of our family instead of keeping it separate." Marcus set down his coffee cup and stood up, walking over to where Emma sat on the porch railing. Without saying anything, he pulled her into the kind of hug that conveyed everything words couldn't capture. Pride, love, gratitude, and the bone-deep relief of someone who'd found his way back to joy after thinking it was lost forever. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for teaching me that a heart doesn't have a limited capacity for love. It just keeps expanding to make room for everyone who needs to belong there." As the stars began to appear over the Colorado mountains, the family, sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Emma's departure for college, the twins' continued navigation of high school, Danny's growth into the kind of young man Tyler might have become. But tonight, they were simply a family sitting on their porch, surrounded by the sounds of home, wind chimes singing in the breeze, cattle settling in the pastures, Chester making soft roostery murmurs of contentment. Emma looked around at the faces of the people who'd become her world and felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that love, once it takes root, grows in ways that would have been impossible to imagine at the beginning. Marcus Caldwell had opened his door 2 years ago to 4 strangers who desperately needed a home. What he'd discovered was that he'd needed them just as much, not to replace what he'd lost, but to teach him that the heart's capacity for love is infinite, and that the best way to honor the dead is to embrace the living with the same fierce devotion. The story that had begun with rejection and fear had become something beautiful. A testament to the truth that families aren't just born, they're chosen, built and nurtured one day at a time, by people brave enough to love despite the risk of loss. And in a house that had once been a shrine to grief, the sound of laughter and conversation and piano music drifted out into the Colorado night, carrying with it the promise that tomorrow would bring new reasons to be grateful for the courage it takes to say yes to love. Again and again, until the yes becomes as natural as breathing. The next morning brought Emma's farewell breakfast, a tradition Marcus had established without consulting anyone, but which had become sacred in their household. Each child's major milestone deserved what he called proper food, which meant pancakes from scratch, real maple syrup, and bacon cooked until it was perfectly crisp. Emma found him in the kitchen before dawn, flour already dusting his work shirt, mixing bowl balanced against his hip with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to cook for 5 people through trial and considerable error. "You know I don't." "Leave until this afternoon, right?" Emma said, pouring herself coffee from the pot that had been brewing since 5 in the morning. "Wanted to get it right," Marcus replied, not looking up from his whisking. "First time sending a kid off to college. Don't want to mess up the send-off." Emma leaned against the counter, studying his profile in the early morning light. 2 years of parenting had taught Marcus many things, but perhaps most importantly, it had taught him that love was expressed through action as much as words. He couldn't fix their past traumas, couldn't erase the years they'd spent bouncing between homes, but he could make sure they never doubted they were wanted. "Dad, you know you can't mess this up, right? There's no wrong way to love someone." Marcus's hands stilled on the whisk. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm doing it wrong, that I should have known about parent-teacher conferences sooner, or that I shouldn't have let Danny sleep in our bed during thunderstorms, or that Sophia needed different guidance when she started dating." Emma laughed softly. "You figured out the parent-teacher thing eventually. Danny hasn't had nightmares since you started letting him feel safe during storms. And Sophia's dating a boy who brings flowers to family dinner and helps with dishes without being asked. I'd say you're doing fine." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of the rest of the family. Caleb appeared first, his hair sticking up in 3 different directions, followed by Sophia, who had somehow managed to look put together despite having just woken up. Danny was last, carrying Chester under one arm like a feathered football. Chester wanted to help with breakfast, Danny announced, setting the rooster on his designated perch, a wooden stool Marcus had placed by the kitchen window after accepting that Chester was a permanent resident. "Chester wants to steal bacon," Sophia corrected, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. "Same thing," Danny said, with the logic of a 9-year-old who'd learned that arguing with his sister was rarely productive. As Marcus served breakfast, Emma found herself memorizing the scene, The way morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, highlighting dust motes that danced in the warm air, the comfortable chaos of a family that had learned to navigate each other's rhythms. The sound of cutlery against plates and the low murmur of conversation about plans for the day. "So what's the first thing you're going to do when you get to campus?" Caleb asked, cutting his pancakes into precise geometric shapes. A habit left, over from his years of trying to control small things when the big things felt unmanageable. "Probably cry," Emma said honestly, "then unpack. Then call home to make sure Danny practiced piano and that Chester hasn't eaten anything important." "I never eat important things," Danny protested, then paused. "What counts as important? Homework, documents, small children," Sophia rattled off. "The usual Chester no-nos." Chester ruffled his feathers indignantly, as if he understood the accusations being leveled against him. Marcus watched this familiar banter with the expression Emma had come to recognize. Part amusement, part wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe his house contained this much life and noise and affection. "You know," Marcus said, addressing Emma directly, "your room will be exactly as you left it when you come home for Thanksgiving." "Dad, you don't have to. It's not going anywhere," he continued firmly. "None of your things, none of the way you arranged Tyler's books with yours, none of the photos on the walls. This is your home, and it always will be." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been so focused on the excitement of college, on the prospect of independence and new experiences, that she hadn't fully confronted the fear that had been lurking. Underneath, the old, familiar terror that leaving might mean losing her place, that absence might be interpreted as abandonment. "Besides," Danny added cheerfully, "Chester would be sad if your room got changed. He likes to sit on your windowsill and judge the cattle." "Chester judges everyone," Sophia pointed out. "It's his primary hobby." "Secondary hobby," Caleb corrected. "My primary hobby is plotting to steal food." The laughter that filled the kitchen was warm and easy, the kind of family joke that develops over time and shared experience. Emma looked around the table at these people who'd become her world, and felt the bittersweet recognition that this was exactly the kind of moment she'd dreamed of during all those years of temporary placements, ordinary family breakfast conversation. That felt extraordinary because it was hers. After breakfast, Emma's college departure preparations began in earnest. Her belongings were already mostly packed, but there were last-minute additions, forgotten items discovered in unexpected places, and the inevitable emotional weight of deciding what pieces of home to carry with her. Marcus appeared in her doorway, holding a small, wrapped package. "This is from all of us," he said, settling into the chair by her window, Tyler's old reading chair, which Emma had moved to catch the morning light. Emma unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a silver locket that looked like it had been crafted by local artisans. Inside, she found 2 tiny photographs, one of their current family taken during a barbecue that summer, all 5 of them grinning at Dorothy Morrison's camera. The other was the photograph of Tyler that now sat on her dresser. "So you carry both families with you," Marcus explained quietly. "The one that made you who you were, and the one that helped you become who you are." Emma's throat tightened with emotion. The gesture was so perfectly Marcus, practical and sentimental in equal measure, acknowledging both her past and her present without trying to replace one with the other. "There's something else," he continued, pulling out a business card. "Dr. Patricia Reyes. She runs the counseling center at Colorado State, and she specializes in working with students who've aged out of foster care. Janet recommended her." Emma turned the card over in her hands, recognizing the gift for what it was, not a suggestion that she needed fixing, but an acknowledgement that transition was challenging for everyone, and that having professional support wasn't a sign of weakness. "You don't have to use it if you don't want to," Marcus added quickly, "but it's there if you need it." "Thank you," Emma said simply, understanding that this represented weeks of planning and research on Marcus's part, his attempt to anticipate. challenges she might face, and provide resources before she even knew she needed them. The afternoon arrived too quickly. Emma's belongings were loaded into Marcus's truck, and suddenly it was time for the goodbye she'd been dreading and anticipating. In equal measure, the family gathered on the front porch, their traditional staging area for important moments. Danny had positioned himself for optimal hugging access, while the twins maintained their carefully casual facades that didn't quite hide their emotion. "You have to call every week," Sophia said, her voice fierce with protective love. "And send pictures of your dorm room, and tell us if anyone's mean to you so we can come beat them up." "I will call," Emma laughed, "but I think I can handle any mean people myself." "Dad's been practicing his threatening parent voice," Caleb added helpfully. "Just in case anyone needs intimidating." Marcus looked mortified. "I have not been." "Yes, you have," all four children said simultaneously, which made even Marcus laugh despite his embarrassment. Emma hugged each sibling individually, memorizing the way Danny fit perfectly under her chin, the way Sophia tried to act tough while clinging tighter than anyone, the way Caleb whispered, "Proud of you," in her ear as if it were a secret. Marcus's goodbye was the hardest. He held her for a long moment, and she could feel him trying to imprint the memory, to capture this moment before time carried it away. "I know I didn't raise you from the beginning," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "But watching you grow into who you've become, it's been the greatest privilege of my life." "You did raise me," Emma replied firmly. "Maybe not from birth, but you raised me from broken to whole. You taught me what it means to belong somewhere. That's the most important kind of raising there is." The drive to Colorado State University took 3 hours, during which Marcus offered approximately 17 different pieces of parenting advice, ranging from practical, "always keep quarters for laundry," to philosophical, "remember that's smart doesn't mean you have to be perfect," to the completely obvious, "don't forget to eat vegetables." Emma let him talk, understanding that this was his way of processing the magnitude of letting his first child venture into the world independently. Every piece of advice was an expression of love, a way of trying to protect her, even when protection meant letting go. When they finally arrived at the sprawling campus, Marcus insisted on helping her carry everything to her dorm room, meeting her roommate, and conducting what Emma privately termed his thorough investigation of the building's security measures and emergency procedures. "Dad," Emma said gently as he examined the lock on her dorm room door for the 3rd time, "I'm going to be fine." Marcus straightened up, running his hands through his grey hair. "I know. It's just, this is the first time in 2 years that I won't know exactly where you are and whether you've eaten dinner." Emma felt her heart clench with affection for this man who'd learned to love so completely that the thought of her being 3 hours away felt like sending her to another planet. "I promise to eat dinner," she said solemnly, "and to call if I need anything, and to come home the minute I miss your pancakes too much to function." That earned her a smile. "My pancakes are pretty irresistible." As Marcus prepared to leave, Emma walked him down to the parking lot, both of them trying to drag out these final moments. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains that were visible even from campus, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of home. "You know," Marcus said, leaning against his truck, 2 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be dropping my daughter off at college, I would have thought they were crazy. 2 years ago, if someone had told me I'd have a father who cared enough to embarrass me by examining my dorm room locks, I would have thought they were lying." Marcus laughed. "Fair point." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them aware that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Emma was no longer the frightened 16-year-old who'd appeared at his door with 3 younger siblings and nowhere else to go. Marcus was no longer the isolated, grief-stricken man who'd built walls around his heart to keep the world out. "Dad," Emma said finally, "thank you for everything, but especially for showing me that love doesn't run out when you share it, that there's always room for one more person at the table, one more story, one more chance to get it right." Marcus pulled her into one final hug, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "You're going to do amazing things," he said quietly, "and when you do, remember that you've got 4 people back home who are proud of you no matter what." 5 people, Emma corrected. "Tyler's proud of us too." Marcus pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright with tears he wasn't trying to hide. Yeah, I think he is." As Marcus's truck disappeared into the evening traffic, Emma stood in the campus parking lot feeling the weight of transition. Excitement and homesickness and anticipation all tangled together in her chest. She was 18 years old, standing at the threshold of independence, carrying with her the love of a family that had taught her the difference between surviving and thriving. In her pocket, the locket rested against her heart, holding the images of both her families, the one she'd lost and the one she'd found. In her memory, she carried the sound of piano music drifting through a house that had learned to be a home again. And in her future, she carried the knowledge that love, once it takes root, creates an unbreakable connection that distance can stretch but never sever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new friendships, new opportunities to grow and learn and become whoever she was meant to be. But tonight, she was Emma Rodriguez Caldwell, daughter and sister and survivor, heading back to her dorm room with the absolute certainty that no matter how far she traveled or how much she changed, she would always have a place at Marcus Caldwell's. A kitchen table where Chester the rooster held court and pancakes were made from scratch, and love was measured not by perfection, but by presence. The story that had begun with 4 orphan children begging not to be sent away had become something beautiful, a testament to the truth that families are built not just by blood, but by choice, commitment, and the daily decision to show up for the people who matter most. The phone rang at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, jolting Marcus from sleep with the particular terror that middle-of-the-night calls bring to parents. He fumbled for the receiver, his heart hammering as worst-case scenarios flooded his mind. "Dad?" Emma's voice was thick with tears and exhaustion. "Emma? What's wrong? Are you hurt?" Marcus was already sitting up, automatically reaching for the clothes he'd left on the chair beside his bed. "I'm okay. I'm not hurt. I just—" Her voice broke, and Marcus could hear her struggling to control her breathing. "I had the worst nightmare, and I woke up, and for a minute I couldn't remember where I was, and I felt so alone, and I know it's stupid to call you in the middle of the night. But, Emma," Marcus's voice was gentle but firm, "it's not stupid. Tell me about the nightmare." Through the phone line, he could hear her settling into what he recognized as her favorite study spot, the window seat in her dorm room that overlooked the quad. She'd sent him pictures of how she'd arranged it with pillows and fairy lights, creating a little sanctuary that reminded her of home. "I dreamed we were back in the system," she said quietly. "All of us. But we were the ages we are now instead, of kids. And you were there, but you couldn't see us or hear us, and we kept trying to tell you that we belonged with you. But every time we got close, someone would move us to a different placement." Marcus felt his chest tighten with protective fury at the subconscious fears that still haunted his daughter even 6 months into her college experience. "That's not going to happen. You know that, right? What we have isn't something that can be undone by paperwork or bureaucracy or distance. I know that logically. But sometimes at night, when I'm stressed about exams, or when my roommate's boyfriend is being awful to her, or when I see other kids here who talk about going home for weekends like it's guaranteed," Emma's voice trailed off, Marcus understood immediately. College had introduced Emma to a world where other students took their family connections for granted in ways she never could, where home was an assumption rather than a miracle. "Want to hear what your siblings are up to?" Marcus asked, settling back against his pillows with the phone cradled against his ear. "Might help get your mind off the dream. Please." Danny's been working on a new composition. He calls it Emma's Song, and it's apparently about brave sisters who go on adventures but always come home. He plays it every morning after you call, like he's sending the music to you somehow. Emma's soft laugh carried clearly across the phone line. "That sounds like Danny." Sophia auditioned for the lead in the spring play, some Shakespeare thing I can't pronounce. She spent 3 hours yesterday practicing her audition monologue for Chester, who provided what she called constructive criticism by pecking at her script. "Chester's always been our toughest audience," Emma said, and Marcus could hear her, settling more comfortably into her makeshift nest. "And Caleb's been helping me plan the expansion of the chicken coop. Apparently we need to provide luxury accommodations for Chester's advancing years. The boy's drawn up blueprints that would make an architect weep with pride." "He always was good at building things," Emma murmured, her voice beginning to relax as the familiar rhythm of family updates worked its magic. Marcus continued talking, sharing the small details that made up their daily lives. How Sophia had convinced the drama teacher to let her direct a short play written by the middle school students. How Danny had started giving piano lessons to 3 kids from town, approaching his teaching duties with the seriousness of a conservatory professor. How Caleb had begun talking about studying architecture, inspired by his work on various ranch improvement projects. "The house feels different when you're not here," Marcus admitted as Emma's breathing began to even out. "Not empty exactly, but like we're saving space for you. Danny sets 5 places at the table out of habit. Sophia leaves the light on in your room every night. Caleb keeps finding excuses to fix things near your window, like he's maintaining it for your return." "What about you?" Emma asked softly. Marcus considered the question seriously. What did he do to cope with Emma's absence? How did he handle the strange adjustment of parenting at a distance, of trusting that the young woman he'd helped raise was capable of navigating challenges without his immediate support? "I've been writing you letters," he said finally. "Old-fashioned. Ones with paper and envelopes. I write one every Sunday, telling you about the week, about things I notice or think about. Most of them I don't send. Why not? Because they're more for me than for you, I think. A way of talking to you when you're not here. A way of processing what it means to watch your child become independent while still being your child." Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Would you send me one? Just one? I think I'd like to read your thoughts when I'm feeling disconnected from home." "I'll mail one tomorrow," Marcus promised. "Actually, I'll send the one I wrote about Tyler's birthday." January 15th had marked what would have been Tyler's 23rd birthday, the first time Marcus had acknowledged the date without devastating grief, the first time he'd been able to celebrate his son's memory rather than simply endure it. The family had made Tyler's favorite chocolate cake and told stories about him that focused on joy rather than loss. Danny had played Tyler's mountain song, and somehow it had sounded like celebration rather than mourning. "I'd like that," Emma said. "I almost called that day, but I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk about it or if it would make things harder." "It would have been perfect if you'd called," Marcus said honestly. "Tyler was part of our family story long before you came. To us. His birthday belongs to all of us now." They talked for another hour, drifting through topics that ranged from Emma's psychology classes to Danny's latest Chester-related adventures to Marcus's ongoing attempts to master the art of cooking for 4 instead of 5. The conversation was rambling and comfortable, the kind of middle-of-the-night heart-to-heart that happens when defenses are down and the darkness makes honesty easier. "Dad," Emma said, as their conversation began to wind down, Yeah, I think I'm going to make an appointment with Dr. Reyes, the counselor you told me about. Marcus felt a surge of pride at her decision. That sounds like a good idea. What made you decide? Something you said once, about how healing doesn't mean forgetting where you came from. It means learning to carry your past without letting it define your future. I think I need help figuring out how to do that while I'm building this new life. I think that's very wise, Marcus said. And Emma, there's no shame in asking for help. It's actually one of the bravest things you can do. After they hung up, Marcus lay awake, thinking about the strange paradox of successful parenting, how the goal was to raise children who no longer needed you, but who chose to stay connected anyway. Emma's midnight phone call wasn't a sign of failure or excessive dependence. It was evidence that their bond was strong enough to provide comfort across distance and time zones. He thought about the letter he'd write to her tomorrow, about how to capture in words the pride he felt watching her navigate independence while maintaining her connections to home. He thought about Tyler and how his son would have been proud of the young woman Emma had become, of the way she'd helped heal their fractured family by allowing them to love her. The next morning brought its own small revelations. Marcus found Danny in the kitchen before dawn, not unusual in itself, but this time he was attempting to make pancakes with the focused determination of someone undertaking a sacred mission. "Special occasion?" Marcus asked, surveying the flour-dusted chaos his youngest son had created. "Emma sounded sad when she called you last night," Danny said, without looking up from his mixing bowl. "I thought if I made her favorite breakfast and took pictures, it might make her smile." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion at this 9-year-old's instinctive understanding of how to love someone at a distance. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Want some help getting the consistency right?" Together they salvaged Danny's well-intentioned but technically challenged pancake batter, and Marcus found himself thinking about the different ways love expresses itself, through midnight phone calls and carefully written letters, through pancake pictures and saved places at the dinner table, through the simple act of showing up for someone even when they're not physically present. Sophia appeared as they were flipping the first batch of pancakes, her hair twisted into the elaborate braids she'd learned from a YouTube tutorial. "Are we having a Danny's pancake adventure morning?" she asked, surveying the kitchen with the practiced eye of someone who'd witnessed many of her youngest brother's culinary experiments. "We're sending love to Emma via breakfast photography," Danny explained solemnly. Sophia's expression softened immediately. "That's actually really sweet. Can I help with the artistic direction? I've been learning about composition in my photography elective." By the time Caleb wandered downstairs, they'd created what could only be described as a pancake masterpiece. Perfectly golden rounds arranged with fresh fruit and genuine maple syrup, photographed with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for magazine shoots. "This is either the most thoughtful thing I've ever seen or the most ridiculous," Caleb said, but his tone was affectionate rather than mocking. "It's both," Marcus said, ruffling Danny's hair as the boy typed out a text message to accompany. "The photos. Sometimes the most thoughtful things seem ridiculous to people who don't understand love." The text Danny composed was pure 9-year-old earnestness. "We made you pancakes even though you can't eat them. Dad helped with the mixing, and Sophia helped with the pretty arrangement, and Caleb helped by not making fun of us too much. Chester supervised. We love you and miss you and hope your day is full of good things." Emma's response came 20 minutes later. A photo of herself in her dorm room, holding a dining hall muffin while tears of laughter streamed down her cheeks with the caption, "Best breakfast I've ever had, and I didn't even eat it. You guys are perfect. I love you too." The exchange set the tone for a day that felt lighter somehow, as if Danny's instinctive gesture of love had reminded them all that distance was just geography, not emotional reality. Marcus went about his ranch work with the satisfaction that comes from knowing your family is functioning as it should, supporting each other, reaching across miles to provide comfort, creating new traditions that honored both their individual growth and their collective bond. That evening, as Marcus sat down to write his weekly letter to Emma, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected education that parenting had provided. 2.5 years ago, he'd thought he understood love, had experienced it with Tyler, lost it when Tyler died, and assumed that was the end of his capacity for that kind of connection. But Emma, Danny, Sophia, and Caleb had taught him that love wasn't finite. It didn't run out when shared, didn't diminish when stretched across distance, didn't weaken when tested by separation or challenge. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger with practice, more resilient with time, more creative in finding ways to bridge whatever gaps threatened to divide it. He wrote about Danny's pancake project, about Sophia's upcoming audition, about Caleb's architectural dreams, about Chester's continued reign as the ranch's most opinionated resident. But mostly, he wrote about the discovery that successful families weren't those who stayed physically together forever, but those who learned to carry each other in their hearts, no matter where life took them. The letter he sealed and addressed to Emma Rodriguez Caldwell contained more than weekly updates. It carried with it the accumulated wisdom of a man who'd learned that the best way to honor the dead was to love the living with fierce, unwavering devotion. That healing didn't require forgetting, but rather integrating loss into a larger story of resilience and hope. That families formed by choice could be just as strong, sometimes stronger, than those created by blood. As Marcus walked to the mailbox under a sky full of Colorado stars, he thought about Tyler, who would have been Emma's age now, who would have loved his adopted siblings with the same generous heart that had made him so easy to adore. Tyler's presence in their family wasn't a ghost or a shadow anymore. It was a blessing, a reminder that love persists beyond death, that memories can become foundations rather than barriers. The letter dropped into the mailbox with a satisfying thunk, beginning its journey to a daughter who was learning to be independent, while remaining connected, who was discovering that home wasn't a place she'd left behind, but a feeling she carried within her wherever she went. Back in the house, Danny was practicing piano, his small fingers finding melodies that seemed to capture everything Marcus felt, but couldn't always express in words. The music drifted through rooms that had once echoed with silence and grief, filling them instead with the sound of a family that had learned to make harmony from discord, beauty from broken pieces, hope from the courage to try again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new tests of the bonds they'd forged through choice and commitment rather than obligation. But tonight, Marcus Caldwell sat in his kitchen, listening to his son play music that seemed to bridge the distance between earth and heaven, between past and present, between loss and love, and knew that some stories, the best stories, don't really end. They just keep expanding, making room for new chapters, new voices, new verses in songs that were always meant to be sung by families brave enough to believe that love, once it takes root, can weather any storm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.